Jeffrey Dahmer was an American serial killer who took the lives of 17 males between 1978 and 1991. Over the course of more than 13 years, Dahmer sought out men, mostly African American, at gay bars, malls, and bus stops, lured them home with promises of money or sex, and gave them alcohol laced with drugs before strangling them to death. He would then engage in sexual acts with the corpse before dismembering and disposing of them, often keeping their skulls and their genitals as souvenirs. He frequently took photos of his victims in various stages of the murder process, so he could recollect each act afterwards and relive the experience. Dahmer was captured in 1991 and sentenced to 16 life terms. He was killed by fellow prison inmate Christopher Scarver in 1994. Dahmer was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on May 21, 1960, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. He was described as an energetic and happy child until age 14, when surgery to correct his double hernia seemed to affect the change in the boy. Noticeably subdued, he became increasingly withdrawn following the birth of his younger brother and family frequent moves. By his early teens, he was tense and largely friendless. Dahmer claims that his compulsions towards necrophilia and murder began around age 14, but it appeared that the breakdown of his parents' marriage and their divorce a few years later may have been the catalyst for turning these thoughts into actions. By the time of his first killing, Dahmer's alcoholic consumption had spun out of control. He dropped out of Ohio State University after one quarter term, and his recently remarried father insisted that he join the army. Dahmer enlisted late December 1978 and was posted to Germany shortly thereafter. His drinking problem persisted, and in the early 1981, the Army discharged him, although German authorities would later investigate possible connections between Dahmer's and the murders that took place in the area during the time. It is not believed that he took any more victory on serving in armed forces. Following the discharge, Dahmer returned home to Ohio, and an arrest later that year for disorderly conduct prompted his father to send Dahmer to live with his grandmother in Wisconsin. But his alcohol problems continued, and he was arrested the following summer for indecent exposure. He was arrested once again in 1986 when two boys accused him of masturbating in front of him. He received 1-year probationary sentence. Dahmer murdered 17 men between 1978 and 1991. He was careful to select his victims on this fringe society, who were often errant or borderline criminal, making disappearance less noticeable and reducing the likelihood of his capture. He lured them to his home and with promises of money and sex, then strangled them to death. He engaged in sexual acts with the bodies and kept body parts and photos as souvenirs. Dahmer's first murder occurred just after graduating high school in June 1978, when he picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks and took him home to his parents' house. Dahmer proceeded to get the young man drunk. When Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer killed him by striking him in the head and strangling him with a barbell. Dahmer dismembered the corpse of his first victim, packed the body parts into plastic bags, and buried them behind his parents' house. He later exhumed the remains, crushed the bones with a sledgehammer, and scattered them across the wooden ravine. It wasn't until September 1987 that Dahmer took his second victim, Stephen Toomey. They checked into a hotel and drank, and Dahmer eventually woke to find Toomey dead, with no memory of the previous night's activities. He bought the large suitcase to transport Toomey's body to his grandmother's basement, where he dismembered and masturbated on the corpse before disposing the remains. Only after Dahmer killed another 2 victims at his grandmother's home, she did, tired of her grandson's late nights and drunkenness, although She had no knowledge of his other activities, and she forced him to move out of the premises in 1988. In September 1989, Dahmer had an extremely lucky escape, and an encounter with a 13-year-old boy resulted in charges of sexual exploitation and second-degree sexual assault for Dahmer. He pled guilty, claiming the boy had appeared much older. While waiting a sentence for his sexual assault case, Dahmer again put his grandmother's basement to gruesome use. In March 1989, he lured, drugged, strangled, and sodomized and photographed, dismembered, and disposed of Anthony Sears, an aspiring model. At the trial for child molestation in May 1989, Dahmer was model of arguing in his own defense about how he had seen the error of his ways and that his arrest marked the turning point in his life. His defense counsel argued that he needed treatment, not incarceration, and the judge agreed, handing down a 1-year prison sentence on one-day release, allowing Dahmer to work at his job during the day and return to prison at night, as well as 5-year probationary sentence. Years later, in an interview with CNN, Lionel Dahmer stated that he wrote a letter to the court that issued a sentence requesting psychological help before his son's parole. However, Dahmer was granted early release by the judge after serving only 10 months of his sentence. He briefly lived with his grandmother following his release, during which time he does not appear to have added to his body count before moving back to his own apartment. Over the following 2 years, Dahmer's victim count accelerated, bringing his total from 4 to 17. He developed rituals as he progressed, experimenting with chemical means of disposal and often consuming flesh of his victims. Dahmer also attempted crude lobotomies, drilling into victims' skulls while they were still alive and injecting them with acid. On May 27, 1991, Dahmer's neighbor Sandra Smith called the police to report an Asian boy running down the street naked. When the police arrived, the boy was incoherent and they accepted the word of Dahmer, the white man in a largely poor African-American community, that the boy was his 19-year-old lover. In fact, the boy was 14 years old and a brother to Latina. Teen Dahmer had molested 3 years earlier. The police escorted Dahmer and the boy home, clearly not wishing to become embroiled in a homosexual domestic disturbance. They took a curiously look around before leaving. Once the police left the scene, Dahmer killed the boy and proceeded with his usual ritual. Had they conducted an even basic search, police officers would have found the body of Dahmer's 12th victim, Tony Hughes. Before he was finally arrested, Dahmer killed 4 more men. Dahmer's killing spree ended when he was arrested July 22, 1991. The body parts found in Dahmer's refrigerator, Polaroid photographs of his victims becoming associated with the notorious killing spree. The 2 Milwaukee police officers were led to Dahmer when they picked up Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old African-American man who was wandering the streets with handcuffs dangling from his wrist. They decided to investigate the man's claims that the weird dude had drugged and restrained him. They arrived at Dahmer's apartment, where he calmly offered to get the keys for the handcuffs. Edwards claimed that the knife Dahmer had threatened him with was in the bedroom. When the officers went in to corroborate the story, he noticed Polaroid photographs of dismembered bodies lying around. Dahmer was subdued by the officers. Subsequent search revealed a head in the refrigerator, 3 more in the freezer, and a catalog of other horrors, including preserved skulls, jars containing genitalia, an excessive gallery of morbid Polaroid photographs of his victims. In 1996, following Dahmer's death, a group of Milwaukee businessmen raised over $400,000 to purchase the items that he used for his victims. including blades, saws, handcuffs, and a refrigerator to store body parts. They promptly destroyed them in an effort to distance the city from the horrors of Dahmer's actions and a media circus surrounding the trials. Dahmer's trials began January 1992. Given that the majority of Dahmer's victims were African American, three were considerable racial tensions. So strict security precautions were taken, including an 8-foot barrier of bulletproof glass that separated him from the gallery. The inclusion of only one African American on the jury provoked further unrest, but was ultimately contained and short-lived. Lionel Dahmer and his second wife attended trials throughout. Dahmer initially pled not guilty at all to all charges, despite having confessed to killing during the police interrogation. He eventually changed his plea to guilty by virtue of insanity. His defense then offered the gruesome details of his behavior as proof that only someone insane could commit such terrible acts. The jury chose to believe the prosecution assertion that Dahmer was fully aware that his acts were evil and chose to commit them anyway. On February 15, 1992, they returned after approximately 10 hours deliberation to find him guilty, but saying on all counts. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, with a 16th term tacked on in May. Dahmer reportedly adjusted well to prison life, although he was initially kept apart from general population. He eventually convinced authorities to allow him to integrate more fully with the other inmates. He found religion in forms of books, photos sent to him by his father, and he was granted permission by the Columbia Correctional Institution to be baptized by local pastor. Dahmer was killed on November 28, 1994 by his fellow prisoner inmate Christopher Scarver. In accordance with the inclusion of regular work detail, Dahmer was assigned to work with two other convicted murderers, Scarver and Jesse Anderson. After they had been left alone to complete their task, guards returned to find Scarver had brutally beaten both the men with a metal bar from prison weight room. Dahmer was pronounced dead after approximately 1 hour. Anderson succumbed to his injuries a day later. In 2015, Scarver spoke to New York Post about his reason for killing Dahmer. Scarver alleged that he was disturbed not only by Dahmer's crimes, but by a habit Dahmer had developed of fashioning severed limbs from prison food to antagonize the inmates. After being taunted by Dahmer and Anderson during the work detail, Scarver said that he confronted Dahmer about his crimes before beating the two men to death. He also claimed that prison guards allowed the murders to happen by leaving them alone. In August 2012, nearly 2 decades after his death, it was reported that Dahmer's childhood home in Bath, Ohio, where he committed his first murder in 1978 and buried the victim's remains, was on the market. Its owner, musician Chris Butler, stated that the property would make a great home as long as the buyer could get past the horror factor. In March 2016, Butler put the house up for rent for $8,000 for the week of the Republican National Convention. As of July 2017, the house was no longer listed on the market according to Zillow.com.